There's a moment in deep prehistory where the world feels impossibly large and impossibly quiet. The continents are colder, the air heavier, and the sky wider than anything we remember today. You can imagine the first human fires scattered across the darkness like isolated stars, each one flickering against the vastness of the Ice Age world. And around those fires, something extraordinary was true. We were not alone. For most of our species' existence, the Earth was not the solitary stage of Homo sapiens. It was a busy, branching, braided landscape of humankinds, some familiar, some strange, and some now visible only through faint signals in our blood. The image we once clung to of human evolution as a simple straight line evolving from primitive to advanced has quietly dissolved. In its place emerges something far richer, a tangle of lineages, coexisting, crossing paths, and occasionally sharing more than just territory. The world, 300,000 years ago, contained a spectrum of humans. They moved across the same windswept plains, drank from the same rivers, and watched the same moon circling overhead. And though their faces, bones, and languages differed, they all belonged to the same extended family, one so sprawling and complex that only modern genetics has begun to reveal the full picture. For a long time, Neanderthals seemed like the only other humans we had known. They were physically powerful, broad-browed, cold-adapted, and intimately entangled with us in Europe and Western Asia. They became the symbol of humanity's other branch, our sister species, our Ice Age neighbors, our closest evolutionary companions. But Neanderthals were never alone in the story. They were just the first shadows we learned to see clearly. In the last few decades, the floodlight of ancient DNA has begun illuminating the rest of the cast. Some of them, like the Denisovans, entered the stage through a fragment of bone smaller than a coin. Others, like the Red Deer cave people, emerged from fossils that seemed too recent to be so archaic. And still others left no fossils at all, yet their presence is unmistakable in the genomes of millions of modern people. These are the ghost populations, entire human groups who vanished from the earth without leaving a single trace except the genetic signatures they stitched into our lineage. As this story unfolds, a new and humbling truth emerges. Homo sapiens is not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from many ancient wefts. We carry echoes of lives we never knew. We carry faces that never became fossils. We carry the memory of entire peoples whose fires once burned beside ours. The world we inherited was shaped not by one species, but by many, each contributing, colliding, and eventually disappearing as our own lineage expanded. Imagine standing on a frozen ridge 60,000 years ago. The wind whistles through pine forests. Mammoths move across the glacier rim. In the valley below, another group of humans walks a narrow path along the riverbank. Bodies wrapped in hides, tools slung over shoulders. Their gait is familiar, their silhouettes unmistakably human. But their genome is not your genome. Their ancestors branched away from yours hundreds of thousands of years earlier. They are not Homo sapiens. They are another kind of human that once thrived on this same earth. And they are not alone either. Behind the mountains, another population waits. Across the straits, another. In the caves of the far north, another. In the shadow of tropical forests, still another, soon to vanish without leaving a trace, except inside us. This documentary follows the stories of those people, the neighbors, cousins, rivals, and partners of our species. Neanderthals anchor the narrative. Denisovans extend the mystery into the mountains of Asia and Oceania. Red Deer cave people push the timeline of other humans shockingly close to our present. And the ghost hominins linger like genetic footprints in the sand, long after their bodies have dissolved to dust. Together they form a web of kinship and contact that shaped the human story before history began. And as we move through these chapters, one question will quietly shadow every scene. How many kinds of us were there? And how many more have vanished before we ever learned their names? Before we move outward into the stranger branches of our ancient family tree, we return first to the lineage we know best, the ones whose shadows stretch closest to our own. They move through the Ice Age world with a quiet confidence, powerful bodies adapted to a harsher Europe than any we can imagine today. They build fires that push back the darkness. They carve tools with a precision learned from childhood. They stand at the edge of caves, watching storms roll over glacial hills. Their presence is familiar, almost comforting. These are the Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives and the most intimate of our ancient companions. For nearly 2 centuries, they have been cast into roles written by our own imagination, brutish, slow, primitive, simple. But the deeper our science reaches, the more those caricatures fall away. What remains is a portrait of a people remarkably similar to us, yet undeniably different, humans shaped by an Ice Age Europe we would have struggled to survive. Their story begins more than 400,000 years ago, when ancestral populations in Europe and Western Asia splintered off from the African line that would eventually give rise to Homo sapiens. Over tens of thousands of generations, Neanderthals evolved wide chests, strong limbs, and durable bones, capable of enduring brutal cold, demanding hunts, and hard winters. Their skulls grew elongated, their brows pronounced, their faces forward projecting, an adaptation to icy winds and high metabolic demands. Yet despite their distinctive forms, Neanderthals were not evolutionary mistakes or frozen relics. They were successful. They thrived through multiple glacial cycles, surviving for far longer than Homo sapiens has been on Earth so far. When Homo sapiens finally emerged from Africa and moved northward, the meetings were inevitable. 2 lineages, separated for hundreds of thousands of years, faced each other again on the Ice Age frontier. They shared hunting grounds. They shared shelters. They shared firelight. And, as the genetic evidence now shows clearly, they shared their lives. Interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly, in waves, across thousands of years and countless miles. Every time our species encountered theirs, at least a few individuals crossed the boundary between us and them. These were human beings navigating the complexities of attraction, curiosity, alliance, kinship, and survival, not symbols of conflict but reminders of connection. Today, the traces of those meetings remain inside us. Between 1% and 2% of the DNA of people outside Africa is Neanderthal in origin. Small fragments, but scattered widely enough to touch billions of modern individuals. 1 billion living humans carrying thousands of tiny echoes of a people long gone. These genes are not silent relics. They affect how we live today. Many influence the immune system, helping our ancestors adapt to pathogens in new climates. Others affect skin and hair characteristics, hints of phenotypes that once thrived beneath Europe's pale winter sun. Still others shape sleep cycles and circadian rhythms, inherited from a species who lived at higher latitudes, under long winter nights and brief summer days. In a much more intimate sense, Neanderthals shaped our minds as well. Genes linked to pain sensitivity, stress response, and even neurological wiring show traces of Neanderthal influence. The boundaries between species blur not just in the material of our bones, but in the architecture of our perceptions. And yet, despite all we have learned, there is still something elusive about them. something that flickers just out of view. We know their tools, their hearths, their hunting strategies. We can reconstruct their faces and bodies. But what did their laughter sound like? What stories did they whisper to children on winter nights? What did they believe when they looked at the stars beyond the cave mouth? Neanderthals sit at a strange intersection between familiar and foreign. They were not aliens to us. They were not another animal. They were another kind of human, one that the world simply no longer contains. But we carry them in our blood, and that means part of them has survived every bottleneck and every disaster that followed. Their disappearance remains a puzzle that carries hints of melancholy. Climate instability weakened their numbers. Fragmentation of their populations reduced their genetic diversity. And when Homo sapiens arrived in greater numbers, the balance shifted. Not through war, not through extermination, but through the slow merging of two worlds, until one became numerically dominant and the other gradually folded into it, like a river absorbed into a larger flow. Neanderthals are still with us in a very literal and biological sense. Their genes whisper beneath our own, shaping the edges of our physiology. Their story is not a separate chapter of human evolution. It is part of the story of us. Their final extinction was not an abrupt ending, but a quiet merging, a soft absorption into a lineage that would eventually cover the globe. In the vast silence of deep time, the boundary between them and us disappears. And perhaps, when we trace our ancestry far enough back, we find a simple truth. We are the last Neanderthals, or at least the last ones left who remember. There are chapters of human history that begin not with a discovery, but with a whisper, a signal so faint, so improbable, that it feels more like an echo from a dream than a scientific revelation. The story of the Denisovans is one of those rare moments where a sliver of bone no larger than a coin reshaped our understanding of who we are. It begins in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. A quiet chamber, a layer of dust, a fragment of bone from a child, its edges worn, its surface unremarkable. To the naked eye, it could have been anyone's, but when the ancient DNA was sequenced, the result was astonishing. It did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthals. It was something else entirely. A third kind of human, previously unknown, revealed not by a skeleton or a skull, but by the code inside a single finger bone. From that moment, the silent corners of Asia began to speak. The genomes of modern peoples, Aboriginal Australians, Melanesians, Papuans, and some groups in East and South Asia, carried unmistakable traces of this mysterious lineage. A ghost population hiding in our cells long before it had a name. We call them the Denisovans. But the truth is that even now, they remain more shadow than substance. Unlike Neanderthals, whose bones and tools scatter across Europe in abundance, Denisovans left barely anything behind. A tooth here, a bone fragment there, a few sediments carrying their DNA like dust trapped in stone. Their physical forms are almost entirely unknown, their culture even more so. Yet their genetic fingerprints stretch across continents, a quiet testament to a people who once walked a vast world. The more we study their DNA, the stranger the picture becomes. The Denisovans weren't a single population. They were likely many, regional groups scattered across Asia, diverging from each other over hundreds of thousands of years. Some adapted to tropical forests. Others braved the crushing altitude of the Tibetan plateau. One group interbred heavily with the ancestors of modern Oceanian peoples. Another may have met Homo sapiens in East Asia. A third inferred only by differences within Denisovan genomes themselves, seems to represent yet another ghost lineage. A branch of a branch. Imagine that. For every Denisovan bone we find, there may have been entire cultures, entire societies, entirely distinct branches that disappeared without leaving a physical trace. And yet, their biggest legacy lives not in museums or caves, but inside human physiology at high altitudes. The ability of modern Tibetans to survive in thin mountain air, breathing effortlessly where lowland lungs would gasp, is inherited from Denisovans. A gene they developed tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens ever climbed those peaks. It means this mysterious lineage was not merely surviving. They were thriving in regions we would have found nearly lethal. They mastered environments we barely understood. We don't know what their shelters looked like, or what tools they carved, or what stories they told around their fires. But we know this. The bones that carried their blood could stand on mountainsides where most of humanity would collapse. The Denisovans were mountain people, plateau people, forest people, wanderers of Asia's vast interior. Their world stretched from cold Siberian caves to the warm equatorial archipelagos. Their ranges overlapped with both Neanderthals and modern humans. And wherever these lineages met, the boundaries proved permeable. The story deepens with one more clue, one that bends the imagination. In the same Siberian cave where the finger bone was found, another fragment was discovered. When sequenced, it revealed a child with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A first-generation hybrid, a literal bridge between worlds. This is not a symbolic merging of populations, but a biological event, a single individual who embodied the intersection of two long-separated human lineages, a child born into a complex, shifting landscape of kinship, survival, and cultural overlap. We don't know their name or their life story, but their existence tells us something profound. Wherever early humans met, they didn't always clash. Sometimes they simply connected. Sometimes they became family. The Denisovans eventually faded from the earth, their final refuges lost to time. Perhaps climate shifts weakened their scattered populations. Perhaps incoming Homo sapiens absorbed and overwhelmed them. Perhaps they fragmented into smaller and smaller groups, disappearing into the sands of deep time. But their DNA remains. In the lungs of Himalayan populations, in the immune systems of Pacific Islanders, in the quiet, statistical anomalies hidden in the genomes of millions. These shadows in the mountains shaped the world long after their bodies turned to dust. They are a reminder that the human story is not a simple line drawn through time. It is a web dense, branching, chaotic, beautiful. And in that web, Denisovans form one of the most haunting threads, a lineage revealed not by bones, but by whispers from the deep past, a people whose faces we may never see, but whose presence breathes through us still. When we imagine the timeline of human evolution, we often picture the world neatly settling into place by the time Homo sapiens spread across the continents. By then, we assume the older branches had vanished, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in the mountains of Asia, Homo erectus in distant pockets, all fading into silence before our own lineage rose to dominance. But the bones tell a different story, a stranger one, a more unsettling one. In the misty highlands of southwest China, in limestone caverns warmed by ancient fires, archaeologists uncovered skulls and bones that seemed impossible. Their age was startlingly recent, between 14,000 and 11,000 years old, long after the end of the Ice Age, long after humans had invented art, agriculture, and settlement, long after Neanderthals and Denisovans had already disappeared. Yet the features of these remains were archaic, unexpectedly archaic. The skulls were thick-browed, with wide noses and flat cheekbones. The brains were smaller than those of modern humans. The jaws were heavy, the teeth robust. Everything about them looked like humans who should have lived 100,000 years earlier. Yet here they were, alive at the dawn of our own civilization, burning red deer bones for food and sheltering in caves as the first cities rose far away. These people were not supposed to exist, not this late, not in this form. We call them the Red Deer Cave People, named for the animals whose bones they cracked for marrow and fat, leaving behind unmistakable evidence of a distinct lifestyle. But their identity remains uncertain, suspended between theories like a coin rolling on its edge. Some scientists argue they were a late surviving archaic species, a remnant of an older human lineage that managed to persist in isolation. Others believe they were hybrids, descendants of ancient interbreeding between modern humans and archaic populations. Still others suggest they were simply a highly unusual group of anatomically modern humans shaped by local conditions and genetic drift. The truth is that their DNA has been difficult to recover. Without a genetic profile, they remain blurry, an unresolved silhouette in the darkness between species. But the Red Deer Cave People are not the only outliers that complicate our story. Across the islands of Indonesia, researchers discovered Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, a tiny human species standing barely over a meter tall, living until 60,000 years ago, with wrist bones and brain shapes echoing even earlier hominins. On the nearby island of Luzon, another small-bodied species emerged, Homo luzonensis, with curved fingers and distinct dental traits that push the limits of what we consider human. These island species raise their own haunting possibilities. Were they descendants of Homo erectus, shrunken through island dwarfism? Or were they survivors of a lineage even more ancient, something older, stranger, more primal than we have yet to understand? And then there is the dragon man fossil from China, Homo longi, whose heavy skull and massive brow ridges evoke another branch of humanity altogether. Some argue it represents a new species. Others believe it may be a Denisovan. Others still think it belongs on an entirely different branch of the tree. The debates continue as scientific consensus shifts with every new fossil and every new genetic analysis. Taken together, these outliers, Red Deer Cave People, Floresiensis, Luzonensis, Longi, form a constellation of human forms lingering at the margins of prehistory. They blur the lines between timelines. They challenge the idea that our species ever lived in a world without other humans. And they remind us that survival is not a straight line, but a lattice of possibilities shaped by geography, climate, and chance. Imagine walking through a Chinese valley 12,000 years ago. You are a modern human, carrying tools and seeds as agriculture begins to take root in the far west. Dawn light filters across the hills. Smoke rises from your fire. But somewhere in the forest, another clan wakes. Their faces look different, older, broader, more ancient. Their bodies move with a rhythm inherited from a lineage that diverged before your own species existed. You share the land, but not the ancestry. You walk the same forests, but not the same evolutionary story. You are both modern in your own ways, contemporaries separated by hundreds of thousands of years of history. This is the unsettling truth, the fossils whisper. The world of 10,000 years ago, the very edge of recorded human history, was not populated by a single kind of human. It was a mosaic of survivors, relicts, hybrids, and hidden branches. A deep-time palimpsest where ancient faces still lingered in the last folds of the world. And through them we see a glimpse of what the human story truly is. Not a ladder, or a line, or a simple inheritance, but a radiating burst of forms, some enduring, some fading, some persisting far longer than we ever believed. The Red Deer Cave. People remind us that extinction is not always abrupt. Sometimes it is a slow, quiet dissolution. Sometimes it leaves behind fewer fossils than a wandering deer. And sometimes it lingers just long enough for the first farmers to walk past the last archaic humans, unaware that a lineage older than cities was drawing its final breath. There are stories buried so deeply in time that even the earth itself forgets them. No bones remain, no footprints, no chipped stones or ash-filled hearths, nothing a human eye could ever discover. And yet, these stories are not lost, because fragments of them live inside us. We call them ghost hominins, ancient human populations that left no physical trace, but whose DNA survives as silent passengers in our genomes. They are the purest form of absence, entire peoples who vanished without fossils, without artifacts, without even a name, yet persist in the code of millions of living humans. Their existence was never predicted by archaeology. It was discovered through mathematics. While sequencing the genomes of modern African populations, researchers noticed something strange, patterns of genetic variation that could not be explained by known human lineages. Too ancient, too divergent, too deep to come from Homo sapiens or Neanderthals or Denisovans. There was only one explanation. Another lineage had interbred with our ancestors, a lineage we have never seen. In West Africa, the signal is strongest. Up to 19% of the DNA in some populations comes from an unknown archaic group, one that split from the human family tree hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million years ago. A group that lived, survived, and eventually disappeared, all without leaving a single confirmed fossil with which to identify them. Who were they? What did they look like? How long did they endure? The answers dissolve into silence. We have only the genetic echoes, not the bodies. But the mystery grows deeper. A similar ghost lineage appears in Denisovan DNA itself, an even older group that contributed genetic material to the ancestors of Denisovans before the Denisovans interbred with modern humans. A ghost inside a ghost. This suggests a startling possibility. Asia may once have been home to an entire ecosystem of ancient human species. Some we know from fossils, others known only through the faintest genomic impressions. Populations diverging, recombining, splitting again, adapting to environments we can barely reconstruct. Imagine an archaic human community living in tropical Africa 300,000 years ago. They gather food along riverbanks shaded by ancient trees. They know the shape of the land, the seasons, the animals. They live, love, raise children, tell stories. And when Homo sapiens expand across the landscape, some of those children carry within them the mingled heritage of two species. They grow up unaware that their blood holds a future puzzle, one that would only be solved hundreds of thousands of years later by machines decoding strands of DNA. Now imagine another group in Asia. They evolved separately for ages, shaped by climates now lost, perhaps tropical forests, perhaps dry plains. Their faces may resemble ours, or they may carry brow ridges and jaw lines unlike any species we've named. Eventually, they meet the ancestors of Denisovans. Their genetics merge. Their bodies vanish. Their tools, if they made them, are swallowed by time. Yet the imprint of their lineage survives, woven into genomes thousands of miles away. Their stories tell us something profound. The human past is far more crowded than the fossil record suggests. For every species we've identified, there may have been 3 more we have not. For every fossil preserved, millions of bones have crumbled into dust. The world-changing revelations of the last decades remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply a placeholder waiting to be filled by new discoveries. We tend to imagine ourselves as the inevitable outcome of evolution, the single surviving branch of a once bushier tree. But the ghost hominins reveal another truth. We are mosaics, composites built from many ancestries. We are the last survivors of a lineage shaped by countless crossings, some remembered, some recorded, and some forever hidden in the genetic shadows. And the ghost populations carry one final implication, quiet and humbling. There may be even more of them. Lineages we haven't detected yet, threads still buried in the genome, waiting for the right analysis or algorithm or technology to reveal them. If 2 ghost populations have already been found, how many more are there? Perhaps somewhere in your own DNA a tiny signal waits. Ancestry from a human group that left no trace behind, except the code now carried silently in your cells. A people who lived and died long before nations, long before cities, long before history itself began to be written. When the last of them took their final breath, the world did not notice. But pieces of them survive in you. That is the deepest echo of the human story. Extinction is not always an ending. Sometimes it is merely a transformation. We inherit not just the past we remember, but the past we have forgotten, and the past that left no memory at all. In that sense, the ghost hominins are not gone. They walk with us still. They breathe through us. And their final home is inside the species that unknowingly carried them into the future.